The sky had forgotten how to cry by the time they gathered at the grave, leaving only a heavy silence that pressed down on the cemetery like a held breath. Mourners stood shoulder to shoulder in expensive black, their faces hidden beneath designer sunglasses as the casket containing Davina Ridley, beloved daughter of tech billionaire Justin Ridley, descended slowly toward the earth that would claim her forever. The entire city had mourned her sudden passing, the news channels replaying her father's broken press conference, her mother's soundless tears. Everyone knew the story. A rare condition, an unexpected collapse, a tragedy no amount of money could prevent. But as Priest Martin Hale lifted his weathered hand to speak the final words that would seal her fate, a shadow broke through the edge of the crowd. A figure no one had invited, no one had expected, no one had even noticed existed until this very moment. Jeremy Peterson lurched forward through the marble headstones, his faded orange sanitation uniform standing out like a wound against the sea of morning black. Mud clung to his work boots, leaving dark prints on the manicured grass. His yellow gloves dangled from his belt, swaying with each desperate step. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. This was the man who collected the city's forgotten things every dawn, the invisible worker the world walked past without a second glance, the ghost in a safety vest. Yet now, as every head turned and every conversation died, Jeremy became the only person anyone could see. His arm shot out, finger trembling as it pointed straight at the gleaming mahogany casket, and his voice, rough with fear and absolute conviction, shattered the sacred silence. "She's not dead. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to the channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent." Now let's continue. The shock rippled through the funeral like electricity through water. Alina Ridley's hand flew to her mouth, her white handkerchief falling forgotten to the ground. Justin Ridley's granite expression cracked for the first time in 3 days, confusion bleeding into his carefully controlled grief. Nathan Cole, Davina's fiancé, went rigid, his face draining of what little color remained. Olivia Hart grabbed Myra Lawson's arm, both women frozen in crimson and lavender, their tears suspended mid-fall. Priest Hale's prayer died on his lips. The reporters at the back of the crowd scrambled for their cameras. And Jeremy Peterson stood there, chest heaving, knowing he had just crossed a line he could never uncross. "Security," someone hissed from the crowd. "Who let him in here?" another voice demanded. But Jeremy didn't move, couldn't move. His boots felt rooted to the earth, his entire body trembling not with fear but with the weight of what he knew, what he'd felt 3 nights ago when he'd found Davina collapsed in the park. Justin Ridley stepped forward, his 6'3" frame towering, his voice ice cold and sharp enough to cut. "Who are you?" It wasn't a question, it was a judgment. Jeremy swallowed hard, tasting copper and fear. I'm the man who found her, sir, in the park, 3 nights ago." A murmur swept through the mourners like wind through wheat. Justin's eyes narrowed. "The hospital told us a passerby called emergency services. They didn't mention," he gestured dismissively at Jeremy's uniform, his muddy boots, his working-class existence. "You." "Because they didn't think I mattered," Jeremy said quietly. "But I was there. I held her wrist. I felt," his voice cracked, "I felt something the paramedics missed." Dr. Raymond Klein, a distinguished man in his 60s wearing a perfectly tailored suit, stepped forward from the crowd. He'd been at the hospital that night. He'd been the one to pronounce Davina dead. His expression now was a mixture of pity and professional irritation. "Young man," Dr. Klein said with the patronizing patience of someone addressing a child, "I understand you're upset. We all are. But Davina Ridley was examined by multiple physicians. Her heart had stopped. Her brain activity had ceased. The medical evidence was conclusive. Then the medical evidence was wrong, Jeremy shot back, his voice stronger now, fueled by desperation. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Eleanor sobbed. Justin's jaw clenched so hard Jeremy heard his teeth grind together. "You dare," Justin began, his voice dangerously low. "I dare because she told me," Jeremy shouted, and the raw emotion in his voice silenced everyone. "She told me about her condition, about how her body could shut down, how it could look like death when it wasn't. She told me to make sure someone checked twice." The cemetery went deathly still. Nathan Cole's head snapped up. "What condition?" Jeremy turned to him. "A rare metabolic disorder. She said it ran in her mother's family. That if her body ever went into crisis, it could slow everything down, her heartbeat, her breathing, her brain waves, until they were almost undetectable." Eleanor's sobs stopped abruptly. Her red-rimmed eyes went wide. Justin's expression shifted from anger to something far more dangerous: doubt. "Eleanor," Justin said slowly, not taking his eyes off Jeremy, "did Davina ever mention?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "When she was 16. The doctors said it was dormant, that it might never activate. We thought she'd outgrown it." The words hung in the air like a prayer. No one dared answer. Olivia stepped forward, her crimson coat bright as blood against the gray morning. "If there's even a chance." "There's no chance," Dr. Klein interrupted firmly. "I've practiced medicine for 35 years. I know death when I see it." "So did the paramedics," Jeremy said quietly. "But when I held her wrist, her fingers moved, just a little, like she was trying to hold on." "That's impossible," Dr. Klein said. "I know what I felt." "You felt what you wanted to feel," the doctor countered. "Grief does strange things to perception." "I'm not grieving," Jeremy said. "I barely knew her, but she was kind to me. She saw me when everyone else looked through me. And when I found her in that park, when I felt that tiny movement in her hand," his voice broke, "I made her a promise that I wouldn't let her disappear, that I'd make sure someone listened." Tears streamed down his face now, cutting through the dirt and exhaustion. "So here I am," Jeremy continued, his voice raw, "at a funeral where I don't belong, saying words no one wants to hear, because if there's even the smallest possibility that she's still in there, still fighting, still alive." He looked directly at Justin Ridley. "Don't you owe it to your daughter to know for certain?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Justin stared at Jeremy for a long moment, and in that stare, Jeremy saw something shift. The billionaire's armor of grief and control began to crack, revealing the terrified father underneath. "Eleanor," Justin said hoarsely, "the test. When Davina was 16, what did the doctors say about detection?" Eleanor's hands shook as she spoke. They said that during an episode her vital signs could become so faint that standard equipment might miss them, that you'd need specific protocols, longer observation periods, more sensitive instruments." Dr. Klein's confident expression flickered. Justin turned to the casket, his face crumbling. "How long was she examined at the hospital?" "Standard protocols," Dr. Klein said, but his voice had lost its certainty. 20 minutes of observation, multiple physicians confirmed." 20 minutes, Justin repeated, his voice hollow. "For a condition that requires prolonged monitoring to rule out." The priest, who had remained silent throughout, now spoke softly. "Mr. Ridley, if there is any doubt." Justin looked at his daughter's peaceful face, visible through the casket's viewing window. He looked at his wife, trembling with desperate hope. He looked at Nathan, at Olivia, at the crowd of mourners who had come to bury a young woman perhaps too soon. Then he looked back at Jeremy Peterson, a garbage collector in a stained uniform who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by standing here. "Open it," Justin whispered. The crowd erupted in shocked protest. "Justin, you can't possibly," someone began. "Open it," Justin roared, and the cemetery fell silent once more. Jeremy's heart hammered against his ribs as funeral attendants slowly, reluctantly approached the casket. His hands trembled, his vision blurred. He could be wrong. He could be destroying this family with false hope. But when he closed his eyes, he felt it again, that tiny tremor in Davina's fingers 3 nights ago, that whisper of life hiding beneath the stillness. The casket lid began to rise. And Jeremy Peterson, invisible man, forgotten worker, believer in impossible things, held his breath and prayed he was right. The casket lid hung open like a mouth, gasping for air. Inside, Davina lay exactly as they'd left her, pale, still, untouched by the chaos erupting around her. Her auburn hair gleamed in the weak morning light. Her chest showed no movement. Her face held the same peaceful expression that had broken her father's heart 3 days ago. She looked dead. She looked gone. And Jeremy felt every eye in the cemetery burning into him like accusations. "Well," Justin Ridley's voice cut through the silence like a guillotine, "you stopped my daughter's funeral, you made these claims, so tell me." His hand swept toward the open casket. "Where is this proof you promised?" Jeremy's throat went desert dry. His hands shook so badly he shoved them into his pockets to hide the trembling. I need to check her pulse, properly, the way the paramedics didn't." Dr. Klein let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "This is absurd. Mr. Ridley, I must advise against." "Let him try," Eleanor whispered, her voice so fragile it sounded like it might shatter. "Please, Justin, let him try." The crowd erupted in whispers that sliced through Jeremy like knives. "This is disgraceful. Who does he think he is? Someone call security. Probably just wants attention, maybe money. Look at him, probably high on something." Jeremy heard every word, felt each one land like a stone against his chest. He'd known this would happen, known they'd judge him, dismiss him, hate him for daring to speak, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. A woman in pearls sneered openly. "This is a funeral, not a circus for the homeless to interrupt." "I'm not homeless," Jeremy said quietly, though his voice shook. "I work, every morning, 40 hours a week. I just collect garbage instead of money." The woman's face flushed red, but she didn't apologize. Justin stared at Jeremy with eyes that could freeze blood. "You have 30 seconds to prove yourself. After that, I'm having you arrested for disturbing the peace and desecrating." His voice broke. "My daughter's memory." 30 seconds. Jeremy approached the casket on legs that felt like water. Up close, Davina looked even more lifeless. Her skin had the waxy quality of embalming. Her lips held no color. If he was wrong about this, if he dragged this family through hell for nothing. "No, you felt it, you know you did." But did he? Doubt crept through his mind like poison. Maybe the crowd was right. Maybe grief had twisted his memory. Maybe that tremor in her fingers had been his imagination, his desperate need to believe someone like Davina Ridley couldn't just disappear from a world that needed her kindness. His hand hovered over her wrist. 20 seconds, Justin said coldly. Jeremy closed his eyes and let himself remember. 2 years ago, early winter morning. Jeremy had been hauling bags from the commercial bins behind the Ridley Industries building when he heard footsteps approaching. He tensed. People usually avoided him, crossed the street, pretended he didn't exist. But Davina Ridley had walked right up to him with a smile that didn't look practiced or polite. It looked real. "Good morning," she'd said simply. Jeremy had frozen, trash bag in hand, unsure if she was talking to him or someone behind him. "You're Jeremy, right?" she'd continued. "I've seen you here every Tuesday and Friday for months. I realized I've never actually said hello." He'd stammered something. He couldn't even remember what, and she'd laughed. Not at him, just laughed like the morning was funny and good and worth sharing. "I'm Davina," she'd said, extending her hand. He'd stared at it, clean, manicured, expensive-looking, then at his own gloved hand, stained with whatever leaked from the day's garbage. She'd waited, patient, kind. Finally, he'd shaken her hand. And just like that, he'd stopped being invisible. 6 months later, spring rain. Jeremy had been shivering beside his truck, trying to warm his hands between stops, when Davina's car had pulled up. She'd rolled down the window, steam rising from a coffee cup. "You looked cold," she'd said, handing it to him. "Extra sugar, I hope that's okay." He'd taken it with numb fingers, too shocked to speak. She'd smiled that real smile again. "Stay warm, Jeremy." The coffee had tasted like heaven. The kindness had felt like being human. Last summer, chance meeting at the park. Jeremy had been on lunch break, eating a sandwich on a bench, when Davina had appeared on her morning run. She'd sat down beside him without asking, catching her breath. "Mind if I join you? I'm exhausted." They'd talked, really talked, about everything and nothing, about her work at her father's company, about his route through the city, about the way people looked at them differently, her because of her last name, him because of his uniform. Then she'd grown serious. "Can I tell you something weird?" she'd asked. "Sure. I have this condition, had it since I was a kid. It's rare, like really rare. My body sometimes just shuts down, goes into this hibernation mode when it's stressed. The doctors say my metabolism can drop so low it looks like I'm dead." Jeremy had felt a chill despite the summer heat. "That sounds terrifying." "It is, but I've learned to manage it, mostly." She'd laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I just worry sometimes that if it ever happens badly, people won't check carefully enough. They'll just assume." She'd trailed off. Jeremy had looked at her, really looked at her, and seen fear hiding behind her smile. "If that ever happens," he'd said firmly, "I'll make sure someone checks twice." She'd smiled. "You're a good person, Jeremy Peterson." 3 nights ago, the park, darkness. Jeremy's late-night route had taken him past the park gates when he'd seen the car pulled halfway onto the curb, door hanging open, interior lights still on. He'd approached cautiously and found Davina crumpled on the ground beside the driver's seat. His heart had stopped. "No, no, no." He dropped to his knees, hands shaking as he'd reached for her wrist. Her skin had been cold, too cold. He'd pressed his fingers against her pulse point and felt nothing. 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 Then so faint he'd thought he imagined it, a tremor, like a butterfly trapped under ice. "Davina," he'd whispered, "can you hear me?" No response. But her fingers had curled, just barely, just enough. He'd pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called 911. The ambulance had arrived in minutes, sirens screaming, lights flashing, paramedics moving with efficient urgency. "I felt a pulse," Jeremy had told them. "It's really faint, but it's there." They'd checked quickly, professionally. "Sir, step back, please." "But I felt." "Sir, we need space to work." They'd loaded her onto the stretcher, started compressions. One paramedic had shaken his head at his partner. "I'm not getting anything." "She has a condition," Jeremy had shouted. "A metabolic thing, you need to check longer." They hadn't listened. The hospital, fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. Jeremy had tried to follow the gurney inside, but a security guard had stopped him. "Family only." "I found her. I need to tell the doctors about her condition." "Family only." He'd waited in the lobby for 3 hours, packing, praying, trying to convince anyone who'd listen that they needed to check her more carefully. A nurse had finally emerged, her expression professionally sympathetic. "Are you family?" "No, but..." "Then I can't share patient information, but thank you for calling emergency services." "Is she alive?" he'd asked desperately. The nurse's pause had told him everything. "I'm sorry," she'd said softly. And that had been it. No one had asked for his statement. No one had requested his contact information. No one had cared what he'd felt in that park. The press conference, 2 days ago. Jeremy had watched it on the small TV in his apartment, volume turned low. Justin Ridley had stood before cameras, his face carved from grief, and announced his daughter's death. Davina passed away suddenly due to an undiagnosed cardiac event. Our family asks for privacy during this difficult time. No mention of Jeremy. No mention of the park. No mention of the faint tremor he'd felt in her fingers. He'd been erased. Jeremy opened his eyes. The cemetery came back into focus. The crowd, the casket, Davina's still face. "Time's up," Justin said. But Jeremy was already reaching for her wrist, his calloused fingers finding the delicate bones beneath cold skin. He pressed down, waited. Everyone held their breath. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. Dr. Klein sighed. "Mr. Ridley, I think we've indulged this long enough." "Wait," Jeremy whispered. Because he felt it. Faint as a whisper, weak as hope. "A pulse." "She's alive," he breathed. Justin's face went white. "What?" "Her pulse, it's there. It's slow, but it's there." Dr. Klein pushed forward, grabbing Davina's wrist himself. His confident expression faltered. His fingers moved, searching, pressing harder. His eyes went wide. "My God," he whispered. And Justin Ridley began to shake. The pulse beneath Dr. Klein's fingers was impossibly faint, a whisper of life, so quiet it could have been mistaken for his own trembling. But it was there. Justin Ridley stared at the doctor's face, searching for certainty, for truth, for anything that would tell him whether to hope or to finally, completely break. "Doctor," his voice came out strangled, "is she?" Dr. Klein's hand remained frozen on Davina's wrist, his professional composure cracking like thin ice. There's something. It's extremely weak, almost imperceptible, but what?" Justin roared, and the entire cemetery flinched. The doctor's face had gone pale. It could be a pulse, or it could be artifact, movement from my own hand, blood flow in my fingers creating a false sensation. Without proper equipment, I can't be certain. "Then get the equipment," Alina screamed, her careful composure finally shattering into 1,000 pieces. She lunged toward the casket, but her legs gave out halfway. Olivia caught her, both women collapsing to their knees in the wet grass, Alina's sobs tearing through the air like something animal and raw. "She's my baby," Alina wailed. "She's my baby and you put her in a box and we almost..." She couldn't finish, could only sob. Nathan Cole stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He stared at Davina's still form, then at Jeremy, then back again. When he finally spoke, his voice shook with barely controlled rage. "This is insane." He pointed a trembling finger at Jeremy. "This man, this garbage collector, shows up at my fiancé's funeral and makes wild claims based on what? A feeling he had 3 days ago, and we're supposed to just believe him." "I know what I felt," Jeremy said quietly, though his own conviction was starting to waver under the weight of all these powerful people's doubt. "You don't know anything," Nathan exploded. "You collected her trash. That doesn't make you her doctor, her friend, or someone who has any right to be here." The words hit Jeremy like physical blows. He stepped back, suddenly aware again of how he looked: dirty uniform, muddy boots, rough hands that had touched garbage cans 1,000 times. What right did he have to interrupt these people's grief? To give them hope that might be false? Maybe Nathan was right. Maybe he was just a garbage man playing hero. "Nathan, stop," Olivia said quietly, still holding Alina. Her crimson coat was stained with mud and tears, but her voice was steady. "If there's even a chance." "There's no chance," Nathan shouted. She's been dead for 3 days. We had a wake. We had viewings. Dozens of people saw her. The hospital confirmed it. The death certificate was signed. Dr. Klein shifted uncomfortably. The death certificate was based on standard observation protocols. But if Ms. Ridley does have the condition this man described. Oh, so now you believe him. Nathan's laugh was bitter and broken. 5 minutes ago you were ready to have him arrested. I was wrong, Dr. Klein admitted, and the confession seemed to cost him something vital. I've never encountered a case like this. The literature on extreme metabolic comas is limited. If her body truly shut down to the point where standard equipment couldn't detect life. He trailed off, looking at Davina with new uncertainty. Justin Ridley hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He stood like a statue carved from grief and impossible hope, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with business or money or power. For 3 decades, he'd built an empire by trusting data, numbers, evidence, concrete facts that could be measured and verified. His daughter was dead. The medical professionals had confirmed it. The paperwork had been filed. The funeral had been planned. These were facts. But he'd also built his empire by recognizing when the data was incomplete, when the assumptions were wrong, when everyone else saw impossibility and he saw opportunity. And right now, looking at his daughter's face, so peaceful, so still, so wrong somehow, he felt the same instinct that had made him billions. The instinct that something didn't add up. Justin, Alina's voice was barely audible through her tears. Please, what if he's right? What if our baby is still in there? Justin closed his eyes. He remembered. 12 years ago, Davina was 16. She'd collapsed during a piano recital. One moment she was playing Chopin, fingers dancing across the keys. The next she'd simply stopped, slumped forward, silent. The panic had been immediate. The ambulance, the emergency room, the doctors rushing around with machines and urgent voices. And then the waiting. Justin had paced the hospital corridor like a caged animal, his usual control dissolving into raw terror. Alina had sat motionless in a plastic chair, praying silently. 3 hours later, a doctor had emerged. She's awake. The relief had nearly killed him. Later, when Davina was sitting up in the hospital bed, looking small and tired but alive, a specialist had explained. Your daughter has an extremely rare metabolic disorder. Her body's stress response is unusual. When overwhelmed, her system essentially hibernates. Heart rate drops dramatically. Breathing becomes nearly undetectable. Brain activity slows to minimal function. So she wasn't dying, Justin had asked. No, but she looked like she was. If we hadn't continued monitoring, if we'd made assumptions based on initial readings. The doctor had trailed off meaningfully. Davina had reached for her father's hand. I'm okay, Dad. The condition could present again, the specialist had warned. You need to make sure any medical professional treating her knows about this. In an emergency, they need to observe longer than standard protocols. Otherwise, they might think she was dead when she wasn't. Justin had held his daughter's hand and made her a promise. I'll never let anyone give up on you. Never. Justin's eyes snapped open. He'd broken his promise. When the hospital had called 3 days ago with the news, he hadn't questioned, hadn't demanded extended observation, hadn't mentioned Davina's condition. He'd been so consumed by grief that he'd forgotten the one thing that mattered most. His daughter's warning. Dad, she'd told him once, years after that first collapse, if it ever happens again, make sure they check carefully. Promise me you'll make them look twice. And he'd nodded, promised, then forgotten. Until a garbage collector in a dirty uniform had remembered for him. Mr. Ridley, Dr. Klein's voice seemed to come from very far away. What would you like to do? Justin looked at Jeremy, really looked at him for the first time. saw past the stained uniform and muddy boots, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the fear, the desperate hope that he might be right. Saw someone who cared about his daughter when he'd failed to. "You said she told you about her condition," Justin said quietly. Jeremy nodded. "Last summer, at the park, she said her metabolism could drop so low it mimicked death. She said she worried people wouldn't check carefully enough." "And you remembered?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Justin's voice broke. "Why do you care so much about my daughter?" Jeremy's answer was simple and devastating. "Because she cared about me, when no one else did." The silence that followed was profound. Nathan opened his mouth to protest again, but Olivia grabbed his arm, shaking her head. Eleanor stared at Jeremy with something like wonder breaking through her grief. And Justin Ridley, billionaire father man who'd built empires on certainty, made a decision based entirely on faith. "We need an ambulance," he said. "Now, with cardiac monitoring equipment and a team familiar with extreme metabolic disorders." Dr. Klein pulled out his phone immediately. "Justin, wait," Nathan started. "No," Justin's voice cracked like thunder. "I will not bury my daughter based on assumptions. I will not make the same mistake twice." He turned to Jeremy, his eyes streaming tears he'd held back for days. "You gave her a promise. I gave her a promise, and we're both going to keep it." Jeremy felt his own tears fall freely now. The ambulance was called. The crowd backed away from the casket, creating space for the miracle or the final heartbreak, whichever was coming. And as sirens began wailing in the distance, Justin Ridley knelt beside his daughter's casket and did something he hadn't done since she'd first collapsed 12 years ago. He prayed. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours. Paramedics burst through the cemetery gates with equipment that gleamed like instruments of salvation. Monitors, oxygen, defibrillators, everything the first responders 3 nights ago should have brought but didn't. But before they could touch Davina, before machines could confirm what hearts desperately hoped, Jeremy stepped forward with something far simpler. A mirror. It was small, cracked along one edge, the kind you'd find in a dollar store or forgotten in a junk drawer. Jeremy pulled it from his jacket pocket with trembling hands, and the crowd stared at this pathetic object like it was an insult to the moment's gravity. "What is that supposed to prove?" Nathan demanded, his voice ragged. "Breath," Jeremy said simply. "If she's breathing even barely, it'll fog the glass." Dr. Klein nodded slowly. "It's crude, but it's actually one of the oldest medical tests. Before modern equipment, it's how we checked for life." Justin's voice was barely a whisper. "Do it." Jeremy approached the casket on legs that threatened to give out with every step. Up close, Davina looked even more lifeless than before. The funeral home had done their work well, too well. Her skin had the waxy perfection of embalming. Her lips held no color. Her chest showed absolutely no movement. She looked like a painting of a dead girl. Not a living person. Jeremy's hands shook so violently the mirror rattled. What if he was wrong? What if that pulse Dr. Klein felt was nothing but wishful thinking? What if he'd put this family through hell for a delusion? "Jeremy," Olivia's voice was soft but steady. "You got this far, finish it." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The mirror felt impossibly heavy as he held it above Davina's face. He lowered it slowly, carefully, until the glass hovered just beneath her slightly parted lips, so close he could see his own reflection distorted in the cracked surface. Then he held perfectly still. The cemetery went silent. Not the normal silence of people choosing not to speak, but the profound silence of breath itself being held. 200 people stood frozen, watching a garbage collector hold a dollar store mirror beneath a dead girl's lips. Waiting. 1 second passed. Jeremy's arm began to ache from holding it steady. 2 seconds. A bird called from somewhere in the trees. the sound obscenely normal against the moment's weight. 3 seconds. Eleanor Ridley's fingernails dug into Olivia's arm hard enough to leave marks. Olivia didn't flinch. 4 seconds. Nathan's jaw clenched so tight Jeremy heard his teeth grind together, even from 3 feet away. 5 seconds. Nothing. The mirror remained clear as emptiness. 6 seconds. Dr. Klein's expression shifted from hopeful to carefully neutral, the look doctors wear when preparing to deliver bad news gently. 7 seconds. Justin Ridley's face crumpled. His shoulders began to shake. 8 seconds. A woman in the crowd started crying softly. Others joined her. The sound built like a wave of grief finally allowed to break. 9 seconds. Jeremy's vision blurred with tears. He'd been so sure, so absolutely certain. But maybe Nathan was right. Maybe he was just a garbage man who'd convinced himself he could be a hero. 10 seconds. "I'm sorry," Jeremy whispered. "I'm so sore." And then he saw it. So faint it could have been imagination. So light it might have been a trick of the morning sun. A tiny cloud forming on the mirror's surface, right beneath Davina's lips. Barely there. But there. Jeremy's breath caught in his throat. "Wait." "What?" Justin's voice cracked. "What is it?" "Look." Jeremy's hand shook worse than ever, but he kept the mirror steady. "Look at the glass." Every eye in the cemetery focused on that small, cracked mirror. The fog was growing, slowly, so slowly it seemed impossible, but spreading across the glass like frost forming on a winter window. Proof. Undeniable. Impossible. Real. "Oh my God," Dr. Klein breathed. The words broke the spell. Eleanor screamed, not in grief this time, but in something beyond language. Pure, desperate hope-given voice. She lunged forward, but her legs wouldn't support her. She collapsed halfway, and Olivia and Myra caught her, all 3 women falling to their knees in the mud, clutching each other and sobbing. Nathan staggered backward like he'd been punched. His face went white, then red, then white again. "That's not possible. That's not. She's been dead for 3 days." "She was never dead," Justin roared, and his voice carried across the entire cemetery like a declaration to heaven itself. "She was never dead." The paramedics exploded into motion. "We need her on the gurney now. Get the oxygen ready. I need a cardiac monitor here. Careful with her neck, support her spine." They moved with controlled urgency, lifting Davina from the silk-lined casket with hands trained for exactly this kind of impossible moment. Her body was limp, unresponsive, but now she was alive. Now every second mattered. A paramedic pressed a stethoscope to her chest, listened. His eyes went wide. "I've got a heartbeat. It's extremely bradycardic, maybe 15 beats per minute, but it's there. Definite cardiac activity." Another paramedic fitted an oxygen mask over Davina's face. "Respirations are almost undetectable, maybe 2 breaths per minute. I've never seen vitals this low in a living person." "She's in an extreme metabolic coma," Dr. Klein said, his voice steady now, professional, as though saying the words made him believe them. "Her body has essentially hibernated. We need to transport her immediately to a facility equipped for." "St. Catherine's," Justin interrupted. "They have a metabolic disorders unit. I'll call ahead. They'll be ready." He was already pulling out his phone, already shifting from devastated father to billionaire, who made impossible things happen through sheer force of will and unlimited resources. The paramedics loaded Davina onto the gurney. Her auburn hair spilled over the white sheets like autumn leaves. Her face remained peaceful, untouched by the chaos surrounding her. But now there was a monitor beeping softly beside her. Proof of life. 15 beats per minute. Slow as a hibernating bear. But beating. Eleanor tried to stand, failed, tried again. Justin was beside her in an instant, lifting her up, holding her against him as they both shook with sobs that were equal parts grief and joy and disbelief. "She's alive," Eleanor kept whispering. "Our baby's alive." "I know," Justin said, and his voice broke completely. "I know." The gurney began moving toward the ambulance, paramedics surrounding it like an honor guard. The crowd parted like water, everyone staring with expressions ranging from shock to awe to confused terror. This wasn't supposed to happen. Dead people didn't come back. Funerals didn't end with ambulances. But this one did. Nathan stumbled after the gurney, his face streaked with tears. He didn't seem to know he was crying. "Davina, can you hear me? It's Nathan, I'm here, I'm right here." No response, just the steady, impossibly slow beep of her heartbeat on the monitor. Beep. 15 seconds. Beep. The ambulance doors stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow hope and transport it somewhere safer. The paramedics lifted the gurney, sliding it smoothly inside. Justin climbed in after it without hesitation. Eleanor followed. There was no room for anyone else, but Nathan tried anyway until a paramedic gently stopped him. "Family only right now, sir. You can follow in your car." Nathan nodded numbly, unable to look away from Davina's still face visible through the ambulance's rear windows. Jeremy stood alone near the empty casket, forgotten again now that the miracle had happened. His hands still shook. The mirror still showed the faint fog of Davina's breath. Proof he'd been right. Proof he'd saved her. Proof that sometimes the invisible man sees what everyone else misses. Olivia appeared beside him, her crimson coat muddy and tear-stained. She didn't say anything, just squeezed his shoulder once, gratitude and respect in a single gesture. Then she ran toward her car to follow the ambulance. The crowd began dispersing, murmuring, pulling out phones to call friends and tell them about the impossible thing they just witnessed. The priest stood alone near the grave, his prayer book still open to the burial rites he'd never finished. He looked at Jeremy with an expression of profound wonder. "I've been doing this for 30 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen anything like that." Jeremy couldn't speak, could only watch as the ambulance doors closed. The sirens started, that urgent wail that meant life being transported, protected, fought for. The ambulance pulled away from the cemetery, tires crunching on gravel, lights flashing red and blue against the gray morning sky. And Jeremy Peterson, garbage collector, invisible man, believer in impossible things, collapsed onto the wet grass and wept. Because he'd kept his promise. Because Davina Ridley was alive. Because sometimes, against all odds and all logic, the mirror fogs. And breath, impossibly faint, impossibly precious, proves that death isn't always the end. The ambulance disappeared around the corner, sirens fading into the distance. Taking Davina home. Taking her back to life. The hospital waiting room smelled like disinfectant and fear, masked by weak coffee. Jeremy sat alone in a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor, as though the hospital worried someone might steal furniture from a place where people came to fall apart. His orange uniform stood out like a beacon among the muted grays and blues of the medical center. People stared as they passed, some with curiosity, others with judgment. He didn't care anymore. 3 hours had passed since the ambulance had torn away from the cemetery. 3 hours of silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of monitors beeping in rooms where other people fought their own battles with death. No one had told him anything. No one had asked him to stay. But he couldn't leave, not until he knew for certain that Davina would open her eyes, that the breath he'd seen on that cracked mirror would become breathing, that the faint heartbeat would grow stronger. That his promise had actually saved her. A nurse passed by, noticed him, did a double take. "Sir, are you family?" No, Jeremy said quietly. I'm the one who found her. The nurse's expression softened. The garbage collector, the one from the cemetery. Word traveled fast. Jeremy nodded. You should go home, hun. Get some rest. If there's any news, the family will. I'll wait, Jeremy interrupted gently, if that's okay. The nurse studied him for a long moment, then smiled. I'll bring you real coffee, the good stuff we keep hidden from visitors. She returned 10 minutes later with a steaming cup that actually smelled like coffee instead of regret. Jeremy accepted it with shaking hands and a grateful nod. Then he went back to waiting. 2 more hours passed before the elevator doors opened, and Justin Ridley stepped out. He looked like a different man than the one Jeremy had confronted at the funeral. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His tie was gone. His hair, usually perfect, stuck up in places where he'd run his hands through it too many times. His eyes were red-rimmed but clear. He saw Jeremy immediately. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the waiting room. Billionaire and garbage collector, power and poverty. The man who had everything and the man who had nothing except the certainty that had saved a life. Then Justin walked over. Jeremy stood automatically, some ingrained reflex to show respect to people who occupied rooms differently than he did. Sit, Justin said, please. They both sat. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Finally, Justin spoke, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. The doctors confirmed it, extreme neurometabolic coma. Her body shut down so completely that every standard test read as death. If we'd buried her. He couldn't finish. His hands clenched into fists on his knees. Jeremy's throat went tight, but you didn't. Because of you. Justin turned to face him fully. Because a man I didn't know, wearing a uniform I wouldn't have looked twice at, remembered something my daughter told him in passing. Because you refused to be silent even when everyone, including me, tried to make you disappear. Let me finish, Justin interrupted, and there was no anger in his voice, only a desperate need to say what came next. I spent 3 days planning my daughter's funeral, 3 days accepting she was gone, 3 days failing her in the worst way a father can fail. His voice cracked. And you, a stranger who collected her garbage, cared more about making sure she was really dead than I did. That's not fair to yourself, Jeremy said quietly. You were grieving, you trusted the doctors, I forgot, Justin said flatly. I forgot about her condition. The one thing she'd warned me about, the one thing that could make death look real when it wasn't, I forgot. And you remembered. Tears slid down Justin's face without shame. I'm sorry, he continued, for the way I spoke to you, for the way I looked at you, for thinking your uniform made you less worthy of being heard. I'm sorry for almost killing my daughter because I was too proud and too broken to listen to the one person who actually saw her. Jeremy felt his own tears coming. You don't need to apologize to me, Mr. Ridley. Yes, I do, and call me Justin. He extended his hand, the same way Davina had 2 years ago when she'd first said hello. Jeremy stared at it, then took it. The handshake lasted longer than formality required. She's awake, Justin said finally. Confused, weak, but awake. She's asking for you. Jeremy's heart stopped. What? Davina, she wants to see the man who stopped her funeral. Justin's smile was watery but genuine. Come on, she's waiting. Davina's hospital room was filled with flowers, expensive arrangements from people trying to celebrate a miracle they'd almost prevented. She lay propped up against pillows, looking impossibly fragile in a hospital gown, an IV in her arm and monitors tracking the heartbeat that had almost been declared non-existent. But her eyes were open. And when Jeremy appeared in the doorway, she smiled. There he is, she said, her voice hoarse but unmistakably alive. My guardian angel in an orange vest. Jeremy couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only stare at this woman he'd last seen motionless in a casket, now breathing and smiling and impossibly, wonderfully here. Alina sat beside the bed, holding Davina's hand like she'd never let go again. She looked at Jeremy with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for our daughter." Nathan stood near the window, his expression complicated, gratitude mixed with shame mixed with relief too profound for words. Olivia and Myra occupied chairs in the corner, both women grinning through tears. But Jeremy only saw Davina. She gestured weakly for him to come closer. He did, moving like someone in a dream. "They told me what you did," Davina said. "How you interrupted my funeral. How you fought for me when everyone else had given up. How you remembered something I'd mentioned once, months ago, in passing." "You told me to make sure someone checked twice," Jeremy said, his voice barely audible. "I kept my promise." Davina's eyes filled with tears. "You did more than that. You saw me, Jeremy. When I was invisible, when I was literally being buried, you saw me, just like I tried to see you." She reached for his hand. Jeremy looked at his calloused palm, stained with years of work no one noticed, rough from handling things people threw away, and hesitated. "Jeremy," Davina said firmly, "give me your hand." He did. She held it tightly, this garbage collector who'd saved her life, and said the words he'd never thought anyone would say. "You're the reason I'm alive. Not the doctors, not the machines, not money or power or status. You, because you refused to look away when everyone else did." Jeremy broke down completely then, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd held back for days. Davina held his hand through all of it. The media exploded. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Garbage collector stops funeral, saves billionaire's daughter. News vans surrounded St. Catherine's Hospital. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Jeremy gave one interview, standing in his uniform outside the hospital, looking uncomfortable and honest. "I just remembered what she told me," he said simply, "and I cared enough to make sure someone listened." The clip went viral. Within a week, Justin Ridley made an announcement. He stood before cameras with Davina at his side, still weak but standing, and revealed the formation of the Davina Ridley Foundation for Medical Advocacy and Worker Recognition. "This foundation will focus on 3 things," Justin said, his voice steady and sure. "First, training emergency responders on rare conditions that mimic death. Second, ensuring that every voice, regardless of social status, is heard in medical emergencies. And third, supporting the workers society overlooks. Sanitation workers, cleaners, service staff who see our lives more clearly than we see theirs. Heroes do not arrive in limousines. Sometimes they arrive in garbage trucks, wearing stained uniforms and muddy boots, carrying nothing but the memory of kindness and the courage to speak when silence would be easier. Truth is not owned by the powerful. It's carried by those who care enough to listen, to remember, to refuse to let the invisible stay buried. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person the world has trained itself to ignore is the one who sees most clearly, who hears most truly, who saves what everyone else has given up for lost. Because Davina Ridley didn't survive because of money. She survived because a garbage collector remembered she was human and refused to let her be forgotten. Sometimes the most important voice is the one we almost didn't hear. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is refusing to stay silent. And sometimes the man who empties your trash is the man who saves your life.